North Korea has announced that it will now allow its citizens abroad to come back home as its border officially reopens after over 3 years of pandemic closure. For more, we're joined by Stephen Noerper this morning. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Sure. So North Korea is now relaxing the borders for the first time since, I remember, 2020. Why do you think the North made the decision now? Is it because the pandemic is over?
Well, the KCNA announcement was that they feel that at a global level, they've determined that the pandemic is over, and so that makes it safe for North Koreans to return. But it's an important development because it allows North Koreans back, and hopefully it allows aid workers, international organizations, the United Nations, the foreign missions back into the country as well.
Sure. Now, the thing is, North Korean citizens are given up to 3 years to stay abroad generally, meaning some North Koreans have stayed overseas for up to 6 years. Now, what kind of problems has this situation caused both at home and abroad?
Well, reports are that it created some difficulty in terms of both remittances back, which were difficult to do, if at all. And secondly, it meant that people were essentially left stranded outside the country. So this is an important development in terms of being able to reunite some of those who are working abroad with their families back home in the DPRK. And it's important in terms of opening channels of communications. The more flights we have, and they've just started, and the more communication across from DPRK out is a good thing because it opens the international lens on North Korea, and it allows North Korea to express itself and communications channels to be more open.
Definitely, the North has been secluded more than ever during the past 3 years. Now, the regime is permitting the return of people who are not able to come back home because of the virus. So diplomats and students will be able to come back home finally. Then when will North Korea actually allow non-citizens to enter the regime? I mean, will there be specific preconditions?
Well, it's an important question, and it's one that needs to be a next step. So most returning North Korean citizens will be in some sort of quarantine or observation for 1 week. But it would be great to see that open to outsiders and to allow foreign visitors. There just, of course, has been a visit in by senior delegations from Russia and from China, which is a good sign in terms of allowing outsiders. But it would be important to allow aid workers back in. And it would be very important to allow foreign diplomats and representatives of the United Nations who play a very important role in terms of communications and also in terms of development assistance back in the country.
Definitely. You mentioned earlier the reopening will give us a lens to this secluded region. Now, is there any chance that the North will actually return to the international diplomacy with the latest decision? Possibly something with the U.S.? What do you think?
Well, that's the aspiration, and certainly tensions are high on and around the peninsula. North Korea has objected to the exercises taking place now. There's the concern about the increase of DPRK missile tests, and the Hwasong-18 shows an ICBM capability that has become more defined. And so with that level of tension rising, it's imperative to be back at the negotiation table. So by allowing transport in and out and by the communications that flow from that, hopefully we'll see a resumption of dialogue, very much needed for peace and security around the peninsula.
Then will that resumption of dialogue include the possible return of the U.S. soldier Travis King, who defected to North Korea last month?
Well, at this point, they've simply acknowledged his presence there. They've had statements about his concerns of treatment, and there is communication between the United Nations Command and the KPA, the Korean People's Army, about his presence. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, whether he's returned, whether he chooses to remain. But one way or another, that's one aspect. What's more important is, given the security concerns with missile testing, potentially with a nuclear test to come, that there be real talks between the international community and the DPRK. So again, getting international diplomats in, using the imprimatur of the United Nations, trying to open channels for humanitarian assistance, which will be much needed after being closed off for 3 years.
Sure. President Noerper, North Korea is really making its out to the international venue with the participation in the Hangzhou Asian Games next month, right? Now, will the reopening of its borders make interactions even more active between the high-ranking officials of North Korea and China?
Well, one would hope so, because that communication channel is very important. Of course, the DPRK relies on the PRC for a great deal of its trade. It has already opened and had this exchange with the senior Russian delegation. So clearly, Pyongyang is opening relations with Moscow and with Beijing first. There are suggestions that there's a potential visit by the DPRK leader to the Russian Federation that may be in the offing. But in terms of the sports games, sports diplomacy is very important. It's a confidence builder. It's low political risk. Mm-hmm. We saw the benefits of it around the Pyeongchang Games in terms of DPRK participation. So participation in the games there would be important just to show that the DPRK is on the path of opening and that some of the recent activity leads to fuller diplomacy abroad. And again, eventually a return to the negotiating table.
Right, definitely. Now, North Korea is making its out to the Hangzhou Asian Games. Now, what other global events do you think we should pay special attention to with the North expected to make its participation?
Well, I would look at where the DPRK is going, not only in terms of things like sports and cultural diplomacy, but where it begins to open, in particular around the European Union. It may choose to move there before it makes movement on larger fronts with places like the United States. So I think looking for low-level signs, mid-level diplomacy is very important because the DPRK is certainly in need of strategic diversification. After 3 years of being cut off, they're going to be looking for inputs, economic assistance, humanitarian aid, and so there are a number of international players who can come in that regard. And again, essential to have representation on the ground, and that's why moving beyond just DPRK citizens returning, but really to foreign diplomats and to United Nations personnel is essential.
Definitely. Thanks so much for joining us from Hawaii this morning. You enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Aloha, and thank you for having me.